you and I punch you or you punch me, we accept that there's a dispute resolution mechanism in a kind of structural system. Realism as a political theory says that's actually not true in the international system. Who do states go to? In theory, they can go to the United Nations, but they really have no other mechanism on top of them that they can go to that's a legal authority. So when we say something is anarchic, it's often meant that people think, realism means that the world is a disordered and violent place. And versions of it can, in fact, actually mean that. But really what it means is there's no supranational mechanism. We are essentially responsible for ourselves. As a result of that, one of the key principles of realism is called the principle of self-help, meaning that states have no one else to rely on except themselves. They cannot count on allies. They cannot count on an adjudication by the UN. Now, it's important because a lot of people think that the UN has kind of some sort of legal or sort of coercive authority. If you actually look at the UN, and we're going to do this in a little bit in a couple classes, you actually look at the UN is almost entirely voluntary authority. So if I have a dispute with another state, we have to voluntarily submit it to the UN and agree to their adjudication. The UN offers an adjudication that I don't like, what do I say? Tough. That is not the same position you are in versus the police and the judiciary in the United States. In the judiciary in the United States, if you go out an opinion you don't like, it is still binding. In the UN, it is not, right? Unless it's under Chapter 7 authorization, and even that, it's not always enforced. So what you have is a case where the international system is not governed by a superstructure or legal authority. It's governed by states involved in an environment where there is no one they can count on above them, and they must rely on self-help. That's the key idea behind realism. If you're in that position, then what happens and what matters? What matters is power. Because if self-help matters, and if I can't count on anybody but myself, then what do I have to worry about? The distribution of power in the system, and power, in fact, matters quite a bit. Realism itself provides a theory of war, and its theory of war is basically war as dispute mechanism. That when I want to solve a dispute with another state, that war or violence is on the table. Why is that the case? Because there's no one above me that I can rely on. So fundamentally, if there's a political dispute, I have to count on war as essentially the way that the system corrects itself. If you follow a realist worldview, what do realists say? War is not an aberration in the system, it's part of the natural mechanisms of the system itself. If I have a dispute with you and we have no one we can go to, then yes, it comes back to the question of can I punch the person or can I catch and hurt the person? That's essentially a realist worldview. An anarchic system, self-help, states are the predominant actor, and they must rely on war as a natural part of the system. Starting largely in 1979, you have a theory of neorealism. And neorealism is essentially a second-generation version of that theory. Now, I will pause for a second and explain a little bit why neorealism emerged as a theory. If you go to early realists, Morgenthau, Carr, others, you get this question about kind of what is the natural unit of the system? Is it the person or the state? How do you explain leaders? Someone like Hitler, someone like Stalin, how do you explain a leader like that? You also get to a question where you start to say to yourself, well, where does this will or desire to dominate comes from? The early realists generally tended to be people who took an old-fashioned view of human nature, viewed on a kind of Christian ontology. In some cases, they were German Jews that fled the Holocaust. And the argument was that they said, people have a will to dominate. The fundamental answer you get from early realists is, why does war happen? Because people have a lust to dominate each other. That they wish to dominate and sort of overpower each other. The human beings fundamentally are not made of good stuff. The human beings are made of violent creatures that are full of the lust for power, and that leads them to the Stalins, to the Hitlers. It leads them to wars. By about the 1970s, you get a rejection of this argument, because the problem with arguments based on human nature is, and this is an old point that you can often see made, is human nature is not a determinate thing. If I start on saying something that human beings are evil, that's a foundational assumption that primes a certain set of consequences. Neorealism says, no, we can't start on the assumption human beings are evil. Human beings can be angels, they can be devils. There is a mix of what people are capable of doing. So as a result, where do you need to start? You start from the system. And neorealism as a system is based largely on wants. And what it does is it takes the fundamental ideas of realism and it puts it in an almost econometric model. What do I mean by this? Well, it assumes that states operate much like firms do in a competitive environment. There's no adjudicating mechanism, but the key unit is the state. And what matters for describing war in the system is the distribution of power in the state itself. The argument is that the internal characteristics of the unit are more or less homogeneous. So let me put this down into like normal language. I recognize this is kind of sophisticated stuff. What is realism really saying? It doesn't matter what kind of state you are. Your behavior is determined by the distribution of power in the system. That's the key idea. So a dictatorship, a democracy, a state led by a good leader, by a bad leader, in the long run, doesn't matter. What matters for the distribution of understanding states in a system is how much power is in the system and what the distribution of power is. So a wealthy, powerful state will behave in the same way as another wealthy, powerful state, and it doesn't matter what leader they've got. It doesn't matter whether that leader has a lust for power or not. It doesn't matter whether they're a democracy or not. It matters distribution of power in the system. And the assumption is that states are more or less homogeneous. Under neorealism, they say, okay, well, what would happen if you start to see a system where the states themselves are essentially irrelevant, the states themselves are sort of functionally interdependent units, or functionally kind of, the way they often describe it, I think this is a good way to think about it. The state is a black box, meaning what? Meaning it doesn't matter what's in the state. What matters is the distribution of power in the system itself. So then what explains war in our neorealist system? Not your lust to dominate, but what explains it?
It will benefit the power within the state.
Okay, maybe the benefits of the power in the state, but that's too subjective to kind of, you gotta have a more empirical metric. Your will to avoid getting dominated? Okay, so what matters is, remember that power is not based on you, it's based on a structure. What matters in the structure? Think about it. Power is the key metric for when war happens. What matters? Not you and your will desire, not your regime type, but what? The maintenance of power, and that's determined by the distribution of power in the system itself. And what they call this is polarity. How many states are in the system that are powerful? Okay? How many of you guys have heard the term polarity before? All right, so you all know that this is a term. So when I talk about us moving into a unipolar system, what do I mean?
A one-sided system.
One-sided system with one extraordinarily powerful state and a whole series of weaker states beneath that state. What was an example of a unipolar system? United States post-Cold War. It's a unipolar system. And neorealist standard argument is to say, look, it doesn't matter if the United States is a democracy or not a democracy, and it doesn't matter whether we had a good or a bad president. Those considerations that realism would have talked about is irrelevant. What matters is, what is the distribution of power in the system? And when you have one really large, powerful state and a whole series of smaller states, it doesn't matter. It just simply doesn't matter. The determination of war in the system is based on the fact you have unipolarity. Okay, and there's a large debate about, is unipolarity stable? Argument is, generally speaking, yes, it is. Why? Because you have almost a kind of quasi-imperial relationship. Okay, what about bipolarity? What does bipolarity mean? Can anybody give me an example?
Two main central controlling states and then a bunch of small ones.
Yeah. Can you give me a historical example when we had that?
We have that right now, the United States and China and pretty much everyone else.
Arguably, right?
They're in the Cold War.
Cold War, clearly. The Cold War is the clearest example of this. I mean, think about the bipolar system. United States, Soviet Union, Cold War. What matters? War is unlikely in a bipolar system. War is unlikely in a bipolar system because you have two states that square up, they get fixed alliances, and they essentially balance each other in terms of power. That's a bipolar system. And the argument is to say bipolar systems are largely stable. That what do you see? Did you see a war between the Soviet Union and the United States for 50 years? They stared at each other with nuclear weapons. They fought a lot of proxy wars. A lot of people died in their proxy wars. They never once took a shot at each other. And so neorealists argue, what makes war more or less likely? It's the structure of the system. Bipolarity is stable, more or less. Unipolarity, stable, more or less. Your question, which is, are we in that now between the United States and China, is the big question neorealists start to struggle with. Do we consider China an equivalent power to the United States? Or are we still in a unipolar system? Right? In the post-Cold War period, China was significantly weaker than us. And there's a lot of people who said, look, China has risen so much in the last 20 years that sometime around the financial crisis in 2008, we went from a unipolar system with the United States being the dominant power to a bipolar system. That has very different consequences for war in the system. Think of this when they start talking about the South China Sea. Bipolarity is dangerous if you have small crises.
What metric are you using for power? Are you using GDP, military power?
Yeah. So neorealists, this is one of the points we're going to get to. Neorealists use the argument that power is measured in military capability. And that is because it's essentially, as we said very early on, what's it a theory of? It's a theory of security. Where neoliberals begin to critique this is they say, wait a minute. You're going to measure this totally in terms of the nuclear weapons that we have, and you're not worried about something about the GDP per capita? You're not worried about things like the terms of trade. Neoliberalism, as a theory, critiques neorealism by saying, look, economics matters here, people. You can't simply just count the number of nuclear weapons you have and assume that you understand how powerful a state is.
Wouldn't a neorealist then agree that Russia's more of a state threat of a state than China then because of the military and nuclear forces that they have?
That's a good question. So if we think about Russia as a state. I wrote a piece that you guys will read later on in the semester where I argued that the United States has basically two global rivals. It's the Russian and the Chinese. The Russians are a fascinating case. They have a lot of nuclear weapons. They have a military that is significantly outdated relative to ours, but capable of subversion. They have a relatively weak resource-dependent economy. In other words, if the oil tanks really badly, or natural resources tanks, the Russians don't have a diversified economy. And so Russia, in the early post-Cold War period, because of the collapse in their economy, has the economy smaller than the Netherlands. Think about that for a second. Now, it's increased. Why has it increased? Oil prices. And so some people argue that Russia isn't a global competitor. And that's one of the things that Obama argued. Obama said, look, Russia's a weak state, and it's playing a relatively weak hand. You don't need to worry about Russia as a global competitor. Obama's argument is, who do we need to worry about as a global competitor? China. So what did we do? Let's strike a trade deal without the Chinese and everybody else in Asia in it to box out the Chinese, right? Classic thing you do in a bipolar situation. And that's the interesting thing. Trump actually a lot of times argues that we're in a unipolar system. The United States is still the most powerful state. Arguably, if you accept we're in a bipolar system, then the logic of this changes quite a bit. All right, what's a multipolar system?
Multiple powers with multiple attached allies to each power.
Right, so if you have three or more, you're in a multipolar system. Conventional neorealist argument is, what is the most dangerous system you can have? Multipolar systems. Go back to the beginning of World War I, go back to the beginning of World War II. What did you have within regional systems? Multipolar systems. Why are multipolar systems dangerous? Because you see flanking between the three states. The three states try and cut each other out. They strike deals against each other's states. They try and peel off allies. And if you look statistically, it's far more likely to get war in a multipolar system than in a bipolar system. This is where the Russia question matters. You can look at today's geopolitical situation as a neorealist and say, look, we're either in a unipolar system where the United States is the most powerful state in the system, in which case the risk of war is low. We're in a bipolar system with China, in which case as long as we manage our relationship with the other state, then we're basically okay. Or we're in a multipolar system where the Russians, the Chinese, and the US are all essentially trying to box each other out, in which case they will try and peel off each other's alliances. By the way, China, right after we canceled the TPP, came out and slammed the United States, and what did it do? It asked to join the TPP, and Australia and Thailand said okay. Classic multipolar behavior. If that's the case, war is likely, and war is dangerous. Okay? Neoliberalism as a theory, if you think about it, is a powerful, what Waltz used to argue, parsimonious theory. You do not have to assume human beings are bad. You don't have to say, well, it depends on whether Russia is a democracy or an autocracy, or China is a democracy or China is an autocracy. You just have to know the distribution of power in the system, and the distribution of power in the system tells you how states will behave. States themselves are units, and what matters to them is power measured specifically by military power. That's the thing that's most important. As a result, what you do is you basically think of international politics as a struggle between the units measured in military power. Now, neoliberalism as a theory itself is often critiqued, and it's critiqued on the grounds of a couple different grounds. One ground is that it's a very deeply reductionist theory. What do we mean by saying something is a reductionist theory? Brett, what do you think that means? I'm going to call on you. What's a reduction? What do you think that means when I say it's a reductionist theory?
It minimizes
What do you think it minimizes?
minimize the theory of the whole time.
Okay, all right.
It doesn't take into account some of the variables.
Yeah, it's dropping out a lot of variables, right? So think about things that it's dropping out. What does neoliberalism as a theory drop out? It assumes the state's a unitary actor. So we're really going to say it doesn't matter whether it's Putin or the United States that they're going to behave exactly the same thing. So it throws regime type out. What else does it throw out? Economic power. It throws out economic power because as far as the standard realist argument goes, what matters is the size of your military and your nuclear weapons, right? Economic power is important insofar as it feeds into that. Bigger, more richer states can have bigger, more powerful militaries. But on its own, economic power doesn't in fact actually matter. What matters is the distribution of power in the system. It also assumes the links between the units and the system are irrelevant. So whether we have a dense trading relationship with China from that vantage point is irrelevant. What matters from a neorealist is how many nuclear weapons do we have and how many nuclear weapons do the Chinese have? How big is their military? How big is our military? That's the calculation that matters when you think about neorealism as a theory. That's the most popular realist theory in about the 1970s. And it produces a response, and the response was called neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is essentially an attack on neorealism in a lot of different ways. Now, to remember, when we go back and think about this, one of the things we think about, what does liberalism mean as an ideology?
Emphasis on individual freedoms and rights, like the ability to prosper on their own as like a country.
Yeah. Okay, individual freedoms and rights is a good part of it, Jason.
Economic freedom.
Economic freedom is an extraordinarily important part about it. It's commerce as a sort of means of profit.
Cooperation with like other states and institutions.
Cooperation with other states and institutions. So liberalism as an ideology, generally speaking, starts from this question of rights. It assumes states have rights. It assumes people have rights. It assumes cooperation is a key part of states. Go back and think about the neorealist view of the world. What is the neorealist view of the world? It's straight out of Hobbes. It says war is nasty, poor. The world is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. We fight and we have our knives at each other's throats, and everything is measured on the calculation of power. Neoliberalism as a theory, and liberalism more generally as a theory, says, wait a minute, that's a vast simplification. That people don't actually operate that way, that they care about cooperation as much as they care about conflict, and that we can't simply assume that this is the case, that they care nothing about nothing about the need for economic cooperation, nothing about the need for sort of sustained form of cooperation. Neoliberalism as a theory emerges out of classical liberalism, and I want to emphasize the difference between kind of classical liberalism and what we mean as liberalism in modern political ideology. Those of you who spent the last campaign know that the Republicans have very successfully made liberal a slur, right? So if somebody says you're a liberal, it's a slur, right? And that's why a lot of liberals now call themselves progressives, because it doesn't have the same negative connotations. Liberalism, as is classically understood, comes from Locke and comes from Hobbes, and it means an emphasis on rights, an emphasis on cooperation, an emphasis on the value of trade, on the value of limited government, and it has an emphasis on that the notion that the proper government should be a Republican form of government. Where does that come straight out of? We read this in the last class. Kant, right, exactly. What is Kant's big argument? He's a liberal. He's the predominant liberal political thinker. And what does he say? You should have a Republican form of government, that the best form of government is a Republican form of government, and he explains war on essentially that basis. Neoliberalism as a theory has a lot of different variants that reflect the kind of arguments that you see for different forms of liberalism. So you can find neoliberalism theories based on regimes. This is to say, how do we know that we produce peace and cooperation? We get Republican forms of government. How do we do that? Think of the European Union as a nice example of a neoliberal project. What did we do? We got democracies in Europe. We linked them together, and therefore we have Pacific relationships. I mean, it's a really interesting question. If you go back and think about the EU, when have you seen that many states linked together for over 40 to 50 years and not a single conflict among them? Not even a single threat of violence among them. Kant's argument is, why is that the case? You link together an institution, a series of Republican governments, they will form a federation of peace among each other, and therefore you have cooperation. Right? I always like to point this out. This is a funny story. I'll make you guys laugh because I know this is heavy theory stuff. There was one day the British military, which is a funny institution. Have you ever dealt with the British military? They got the direction of a training exercise wrong, and they accidentally invaded Spain. The British military were supposed to be doing this like training exercise somewhere off on the French coast. They got the wrong directions. They sailed onto a beach in Spain. You have all these beachgoers in the middle of the beach in Spain, and all of a sudden the British military tumbles off with guns to run an exercise. What did the Spanish do? They left. Now, it's a funny point, right? All of a sudden the British military, SAS, is standing there with weapons on a beach with a bunch of Spanish beachgoers. But the funny point is, Britain invaded Spain, and what happened? They left, right? Why is that? Because war has been so far banished from the relationship between states that a normal diplomatic incident was not enough to produce a level of violence. Why? Republican governments produce peaceful cooperation. Right? So you can think of those terms. My other funny British military story, this is kind of mean, but it's funny. In Argentina, there is an island of penguins, and the British military actually got in trouble because they would fly over the island of penguins. What happens if you fly over an island of penguins? What do? Penguins all lift up, they lift up, they lift up, and then they get toppling over. And they got in trouble because you made an entire island of penguins topple over, and it was causing emotional distress to the penguins. So the letter from the British military describing the emotional distress of the penguins was a work of sort of almost Evelyn Waugh-like if you want to go read it. It's very, very funny stuff. You can point that out to Dr. Leonard Boyle next time you see her. She probably remembers that story. Okay. So when we think about liberalism as a theory itself, liberalism in theory has a regime dimension. It also has a sociological dimension. Sociological dimension would be that civil society organizations can produce cooperation. So when we think about liberalism, liberalism is essentially a theory of cooperation among states, and it points to different mechanisms under which that can happen. One mechanism is, let's turn everybody into republican governments. Another mechanism is to say what we need is, in fact, civil society organizations. What we need are nonprofit organizations working together, producing a transnational civil society. Now notice, how is that different than neorealism as a theory? Neorealism assumes states are unitary actors, they work like billiard balls. What does neoliberalism assume? Does the internal regime characteristic of state matter? Okay, so on one level, the state's less important, right? Because there's a series of other actors in neoliberalism. That's true. Think about most neoliberalism theories. Do they require the states to be democracies? They do, right? Think about Republican neoliberalism right out of Kant. Kant argues that what should states be? States should be Republican states. Therefore, is that the same as neorealism, which assumes state characteristics don't matter? It's not. It's a different theory. The most important variant for our purposes is what's called commercial neoliberalism. Commercial neoliberalism is essentially the theory that gets you globalization. When we think about what globalization is, it is essentially commercial neoliberalism in practice. And what does commercial liberalism essentially says? It says, well, look, the world itself is not a situation under which we are dealing with constant violence and constant threats of force, that states, in fact, actually do cooperate. And how do we foster greater cooperation among states? George? Trade. The argument here is straight out of the old early liberal class. If you go back and read people like Ricardo, even if you read Adam Smith, you're going to get straight sort of elements of this, and neoliberalism, God, that's a terrible word, applies that to a modern context. And what it argues is, what do we want to do? Well, how does trade produce sort of peace within societies itself? If I enmesh all of you in trading relationships, you're going to fight less often, right? If you're all economically interdependent upon each other? True. So what does neoliberalism argue? How do I stop war from happening in the system? The neorealists, they say, are wrong. The neorealists say, how do I stop the power in the system from happening? I can't, because war is baked into the system, and it's a distribution of power. Neoliberals say, no, it's not the distribution of power in the system that matters, it's the distribution of trading relationships. Can I enmesh you in trade? Now, why would trade make you more peaceful?
Because like the countries depend on each other, so you wouldn't want to go to war with someone that you need to be like economically stable.
Yeah, a classic neoliberal argument says, look, if you and I are mutually dependent upon each other for trade, and I'm buying your coffee, and you're buying the bananas that my country makes, if we go to war, what happens? Both of us lose. Because the economic costs associated with conflict are so high, the density of trading relationships acts as a brake on it.
In some ways, that was wrong with China and their relationship with us.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a really, really good question. So let's think about this in terms of China. If you're a neorealist, what's your answer on the U.S.-China situation? You say, look, what matters here is the distribution of power in the system. And if that matters, then the U.S. military has to be more powerful than the Chinese because we have to maintain a unipolar system. If a bipolar system, it can be stable, but we need agreements on stability. If you're a neoliberal, what's your answer with China? Your answer with China is, I can't turn it to be a democracy. I'd love to, but I have no power to do that. What can I do? I can enmesh it in trading relationships. And if my economy is so dependent upon your economy, we are so interlinked, we cannot fight. That's the key idea of neoliberalism. That if I bury you in trade and you bury me in trade, we're in a position where we cannot actually fight. And it's a really interesting question. Terms of trade between the United States and China are absolutely substantial, enormous. It's one of our biggest trading partners in the world. Large parts of our manufactured goods come from China. Large parts of purchasing our debt comes from China. We have a massive amount of investment in China. But here's the dirty secret. If we stopped trading with China, what would happen to China? If we stopped. If suddenly we turned around and we stopped. They could. They could call in the national debt.
I mean, well, they would lose a big market for their goods.
And what happens when they lose a big market for their goods?
GDP goes down.
GDP goes way down.
Their banks collapse.
Their banks collapse. Their banks collapse. This is called, in the literature, the suicide pact. that the United States and China, through a neoliberal relationship, have locked themselves in a suicide pact. And the suicide pact works like this. They send goods to the United States, we buy those goods. Those goods give them a cash surplus that they don't want to put into their banks. Why don't they want to put that into their banks? Because their banking system has all sorts of shadow debts and is unstable. So if you're a Chinese investor with a lot of money, or you're the Chinese government, you don't want to house it in your own banks. What's the safest banks in the world that you can house them in? U.S. Treasury. Oh. So every morning in Washington, you're the Chinese government official. You go in and you go buy U.S. Treasury debts, which means the United States government has essentially borrowed back the money we sent to China through manufacturing. And so as a result, they're holding a large portion of our debt. Now what happens if we default on our debt? Suddenly they have bad debt. They have debt that they can't call in. Bad for them. Right? What happens if we stop trading with them? They can't buy our debt. If the slowdown happens, you see a run on the Chinese manufacturing. The run on the Chinese manufacturing puts a lot of people out of work in China. In an authoritarian regime, do you want a lot of people out of work in China? No, you do not. You do not want protests in the West. In the western part of China, there are constant riots and protests against corruption and poor working conditions. Government shuts it down with violence, and they underreport it. They do not report how much violence there is in the system keeping the West running. Okay, so you don't want all these people out of work. Then what happens if you have bad banks? Slowdown in the Chinese economy produces a run on the banks. The run on the domestic banks means you have a collapse in the mortgage prices in China. The property market in China bottoms out. Property market in China bottoms out. Does that hurt the U.S.? Yes, because what do we have? Lots of diversified transnational companies with money on their property market. Argument is we are trapped in such a mutual suicide pact that we cannot afford to watch that relationship fall apart. So, follow this logic. What happens if Trump pulls the drawbridge up?
I just have a question. What does, well, I mean, maybe we'll answer it after someone mentions, like, how does he think it's gonna not be a suicide pact?
I'm not sure he understands it. In all seriousness, usually you assume brains. In this instance, I don't. Obama clearly got it. Obama's argument was really clear. He basically said, hey, people, look around. That's our best trading relationship. Where did Obama go on the first visit? China. And he basically said, we may not like their government. We got to do a deal. That was Obama's basic take. Trump, it's not clear. He seems to think we can drop the drawbridges and our economy is so powerful we'll dictate terms to the Chinese. Chinese are furious. The Chinese are absolutely furious with this. And the Chinese see this as a mortal threat. The market shuts to Chinese goods. All of you guys are going to pay a lot more money. There will be a slowdown in the economy. It will hurt jobs. It will hurt the housing market. But it's going to really hurt their banks. And they see this as suicidal. He seems to think we'll draw up the drawbridge, bring manufacturing back, and he thinks that the Chinese have been dumping goods on our market. So you take an American radio and a Chinese radio. Chinese radio costs a third the cost. They've been dumping goods on our market. And his view is by dumping those cheap Chinese goods, what happens? Chinese radio manufacturers in the center of the country can't compete. Those people go out of business. Those people lose their jobs. His view is we'll draw the drawbridge up, we'll make you sweat a little bit, we'll rebuild the domestic industry, we'll come back and we'll do a deal. Is that going to work? Good question. A lot of people argue it's not going to work. A lot of people argue that globalization and the degree of interdependence has gone so far you cannot do this. He's making a really long-term gamble. And he's not the only one doing it. The Europeans are doing it too. And the problem is that many of the domestic manufacturing bases for Western European and developed American and Canadian developed countries have collapsed. And they've collapsed due to this trading relationship.
So does that mean that we could possibly have a repeat of 2008?
Yes. Yeah, we could have a repeat of the financial crisis in 2008. We could have a slowdown in the banks. We could have a slowdown in the property market, collapse in the property market, run on the Chinese banks. There's a lot of bad things that could happen.
So do you think that, like, if it does end up happening, it would be even worse? Or, like, we would have even more negative effects than we did in 2008?
I mean, this is the thing. We're going to do a class on the 2008 financial crisis. The degree of interdependence between the economies is so strong, it's difficult to measure the effects. If you had said to people that what will happen is the United States will pull out of the recession faster than the European countries, and that Greece and Spain would be dealing with the effect of our collapse in property market for longer, because of the degree to which they were leveraged into our debt, and they were leveraged in a lot of other ways, no one would have believed it. We have a lot more institutional capacity to adapt through our financial institutions than the Europeans do. And that's essentially what you saw. If you go back to the financial crisis in 2008, The Europeans had a problem where they had to coordinate macroeconomic policy among 28 states. I tried to get the 28 of you to agree on macroeconomic policy, not going to be that easy. We could do it a lot on our own. Obama acted very quickly. A run that starts elsewhere, and remember, there have been contagions. You go back to 1997, there was a collapse of the banks in Asia, outside China. And people have been saying, watch the Chinese market. Chinese have a lot of bad debts. That could really affect us. Could it be worse? Yes. It depends on how quickly we can maneuver macroeconomic policy. It also depends. It cost us $1.5 trillion in stimulus. And as a result, our national debt went from 10 trillion to 19 trillion. Ask yourself the question, what does our national debt look like after the next financial crisis? 25, 26, $27 trillion. I mean, this is where you start to get into a real question that it could actually be much more serious. And so a lot of people argue that he's kind of playing dice with the U.S. economy in the sense that he's doing this. Financial crisis could be very, very serious if it happens. And what it would do is it would start with a collapse and the run on the bank. When you get scared, watch the run on the banks. If you start to see a run on the bank, that usually starts to mean that the countries are worried they're not capitalizing to cover their debts. Runs on banks are bad. So that's the thing you got to watch. Right? And that could happen or it could not. I mean, this is an open historical question. Okay, so I've lost my train of thought here when I was going back to this. When we think about this sort of relationship between neoliberalism, we are trapped in the suicide pact. And the argument is to say, what does neoliberalism do? It insists upon cooperation on states on that basis alone. And the idea is that trade will essentially matter. Trade will essentially lift all boats. The crucial concept to remember when you think about the distinction between neorealism and neoliberalism is the notion of relative versus absolute gains. And what do we mean by that? When I say relative versus absolute gains, what's the difference?
Relative be like just within the country and absolute would be.
Relative not necessarily within the country, between the countries. So let's say Olivia and I were striking a trade deal. And let's say that trade deal is going to produce $100 million worth of assets between myself and Olivia. So what's the absolute gain that we both will generate? $100 million. How much does Olivia get? How much do I get? Now let's say Olivia gets 60 and I get 40. The relative gains from trade is the distribution of trade between the countries themselves. If you go back to neorealism and neoliberalism, they say very different things. Neorealism says, if everything's measured in terms of power, which of the two of those is more important? Everything's measured in terms of power, which of the two of those is more important? Which of those two is more important if everything's measured in terms of power? I'm constantly worried about you taking a knife to me and we're caught in a conflictual relationship with that. Yeah, the relative gains. Relative gains matters much more. Neorealism says, look, in any trade deal, what do you worry about? Who wins and who loses? Relative gains matters a lot more. What do neoliberals argue?
Cooperation between states.
Produces what?
No war.
Yes, but produces better absolute gains. Neoliberalism says, hey, look, people, don't worry so much on the fact that Olivia is getting 60 and I'm getting 40. Relative gains matters. What matters is absolute gains. Did we all gain from trade? And neoliberalism argues that the collective absolute gains from trade washes out the distributions between it. So you don't look at something like TPP and say, hey, is this good for the United States? Or does the United States get more out of this deal? You look at something like TPP and say, what are the collective gains from trade that we will all get as a result of this? And relative gains are important, but less important. What matters is the collective gains. Now notice, that's a very different theory of international politics, right? Neorealism is a theory of international politics, says the world is a cold and violent place, the distribution of violence in the system matters, and any deal that advantages you more than it advantages me is a bad deal. Neoliberalism says, no, actually, what is the case? The world is not just measured in terms of power. We are enmeshed in all sorts of domestic and economic trading relationships that make cooperation useful. And why is cooperation so important? Because cooperation produces absolute gains. And if cooperation produces absolute gains, the sheer volume of the absolute gains can wash out the small differences. The fact that Olivia got 60 and I got 40. Right? Absolute versus relative gains. It's the most important distinction that you can see among all of them. If that's the case, then what does neorealism do for globalization? Neorealism has some very clear policy recommendations for globalization. Neorealism says if the focus is on absolute gains, if economic trade and cooperation produces peace, then what matters more than anything else? What should we do in terms of a global environment? How should we structure the international political economy if this all matters? This is all true. If neoliberalism holds as an assumption, if the gains from cooperation are high, the absolute gains can wash out the problem of relative gains, if we can eliminate war by trading with each other, then how should we structure the international political economy according to a neoliberal argument?
Everyone for themselves, meaning that you operate for what would benefit you versus what would benefit the others.
Well, that's more realism, right? And that's very much what Trump says, right? Trump is saying everybody out for themselves.
We structure more like commercial liberalism.
Structure it more like a commercial liberal relationship. So what we should do is we should make sure that neoliberal principles dominate the international political economy. If I want to make sure that you and I are rival states and we don't fight, then I've got to make sure we both benefit from trade. And it might be that you lose more on this trade deal than I lose on this trade deal, but in the long run, if we strike a lot of trade deals between each other, we're both going to benefit. And if we both benefit so much from trade, we wind up in the U.S.-China situation where we cannot fight. So then what do I want to do in terms of policy prescriptions for the international political economy? If you were setting up an economy like that, what would you do? Andrew, what would you do?
Lower barriers to trade.
Okay, lower barriers to trade. First thing you say is, look, neoliberalism says low barriers to trade. Meaning what? Meaning that countries cannot restrict imports. They can't turn around to another country and say, you can't import this good into my country. I want to lower the barriers to trade. If I have high domestic barriers to trade, then what happens? Do I get those gains? No, I don't. Low barriers to trade. What else do I want to have happen?
You want to set some kind of rules so people don't essentially challenge the idea of like, not because that's neoliberalism is operating underneath the assumption that the other country is not going to do anything to jeopardize both of their gains.
Yeah, it is. It's operating on the assumption that other countries aren't going to do things to jeopardize their gains. Now, here's a really interesting question. You're right. They set rules. I'll give you a really interesting example of rules they try and set. Intellectual property rules. Right? So how do I make sure, if I'm an American company, if I'm Microsoft, that China isn't just stealing the code to Microsoft Office and reselling it? Intellectual property rights, and particularly property rights. Neoliberalism says we have to have common agreements on these sorts of property rights. I have to make sure, if you and I are trading, that you're not ripping me off. Pirated DVDs, for example. Pirated software. Really nice, clear examples of what they're worried about. Right? And why is that the case? Because they worry about intellectual property rights. So neoliberalism says, if I'm going to have you trade, we have to have some ground rules on property rights. We have to have low barriers to trade. What else do we have to have? Yeah, as many countries as we can buried into those relationships. So think about what the United States has done. We have a free trade agreement with NAFTA. Does that include Canada and Mexico? We struck the TPP agreement, where we have free trade, at least allegedly, until Trump pulled out of it yesterday. We would have free trade with Australia, New Zealand, and almost all of East Asia, right, except China. Where else do we have free trade relationships? South Korea. We have free trade relationships with Japan. They proposed free trade environments for South America. Think about the European Union. What's the key idea behind the European Union? What's the key idea in terms of economic and trade customs trade in the European Union? Lower the barriers to trade among the European states so that it is totally free trade from European states. If you're a manufacturer in Britain, you can sell your goods at zero tariff within the EU common market. That's what it means. When they say they're fighting with the common market, that's what that means. The European Union is no longer a national market. By joining in the EU, you turn around and say, I no longer am going to tax any of the goods coming in. I accept that my radio made in Britain can be sold at no tariff in Germany. Equally, that means that a radio made in Germany can be sold at no tariff in Britain. That's what you mean. If we think about how the international political economy is structured, you see neoliberal trade arrangements in South America, in Asia, with the United States, in NAFTA, and across with Asia, and individually with a series of countries, and within the EU. All of those insist on lower barriers to trade. What's the argument? Lower barriers to trade, does everybody in the EU profit? Everybody in the EU profits as a result of it. Other parts that are important here in the neoliberal argument. Financial liberalization. What does this mean? Movement of capital in and out of markets. You have to allow foreign direct investment. I can't turn around and say, you, make an example, French company, can't buy a stake in my electrical power plant. You can't do it. Why? Because what happens when we allow free movement of capital? Foreign direct investment goes to, in theory, the place that it is most efficient. If it goes to the place that it's most efficient, then we're going to see greater gains from the movement of capital. As long as we have protection of property rights and lower trade, you're going to start to see economic benefits as a result of it. So a neoliberal argument says, well, what you need here is you need a free movement of capital, permission of foreign direct investment, limited property rights, free movement of trade. The final thing that a neoliberal sort of ideology argues is, what is one of the biggest barriers to efficient trade? What's an old liberal argument? Who do they hate the most? Well, who does everybody hate? Government, right? The government is the barrier. Now, why is the government the barrier?
Regulation.
Sorry?
Regulation.
Regulation. Regulations kill businesses. So neoliberalism says, well, what do we want to do? We want a thin government with fewer regulations. So if you're a country that has really, really, really heavy regulations on your markets and stops foreign direct investment, we want to tell you, hey, you got to thin out your regulations. And you got to stop that from letting capital flow into your country. If I'm an American investor and I'm trying to invest in you and you're Venezuela and you're making the regulations so difficult, I want your government, private sector to be thinned out, small, and as a result, I want to be able to put my money in your country so we get absolute gains from trade. Okay?
If this argument doesn't follow political lines anymore because both Republicans and Democrats agree, where does it start to break down on like our most foreign policy experts and
So I would say that's a really good question. The vast part of the foreign policy establishment, I would argue, is probably both either neorealist or neoliberals. Neorealism as an academic theory was very popular from the 70s to the 90s. Most people work under broadly neorealist assumptions. When you hear about people saying, well, what's the structure of the system? It's straight neorealism. I would argue most economic experts are neoliberal. They argue this is a neoliberal consensus. If you were to go back into the 1990s, most economists followed what's called the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus basically packaged most neoliberal policies, and they would go to countries in the developing world and say, hey, country in the developing world, you're now coming out of communism. What you need to do is open your market, guarantee property rights, lower your barriers to trade, thin out your government. And by the way, what's the biggest obstacle in most cases to lower trade? Unions. So what I need you to do? Get rid of your unions as much as you can. I would argue that what you have here is that most of the foreign policy and political and economic establishment would either fall to neoliberalism or neoliberalism. What you're living in is a really interesting time, and the interesting time is that the right and the left have both come to distrust neoliberalism. And why have they come to distrust neoliberalism, particularly as an ideology? They have, because think about this. Do the absolute gains from trade benefit? Yes. Do the relative gains between countries matter? Arguably, right? Trump keeps making relative gains arguments, by the way. He keeps saying, we're going to do good deals and we're going to win. Think relative gains every time you hear that? That's a relative gains argument. But the real issue here is not that. The real issue is, let's say, for example, we follow a neoliberal prescription. Let's look at a country like Venezuela. I'm going to use Venezuela as an example because they're a bit of a basket case economically. Let's say we did this to Venezuela. Let's say that let's say that we essentially broke apart their government structure. We turned to their government and said, look, you're going to guarantee property rights, lower your regulation. We want you to shut down your powerful unions that back the socialists. We want you to open to foreign direct investment. Who loses as a result of that? Who loses? Andrew, who loses?
the people who are getting benefits now, so politicians as well as people who I guess are government payroll.
Okay, so certainly people in the government payroll, private, public sector loses. Who else loses?
Small businesses,
Small businesses might lose. Why might a small business lose?
because with all the foreign trade making cheaper products elsewhere, it'd be a lot harder to sell products in America because it'd be so expensive.
Yeah. This is one of the reasons I wanted to we don't have a lot of time to do it, to get you guys to understand what the concept of a two-level game is. Two-level game basically says this. If I'm a negotiator, what am I doing? I'm negotiating between the United States and Venezuela, but what am I also negotiating with? Domestic policies. And as a result, I have a very narrow win set. What's my narrow win set if I'm negotiating this? From classic negotiating theory, what's my narrow win set?
So level 2 only passes, level 1 passes.
Yeah.
Level 1 only passes.
Exactly. So you have an extraordinarily narrow win set where you're looking for the area under which you can satisfy domestic stakeholders, you can also satisfy the international stakeholders. So I'm trying to strike a deal that has to work for me in the U.S. and Venezuela. From the U.S. negotiator, what do I have to be happy with? The unions in the U.S. are happy, the small businesses in the U.S. are happy, that all of the domestic stakeholders in the U.S. are happy. Think about Venezuela. Do they have to do the same thing? So what are they engaged in when they negotiate? This is why it's called a two-level game. Because if I'm sitting across the table from you, it's not that you and I are just playing one game, but I'm actually going behind my back saying, is everybody okay on my side with this? And you're doing exactly the same thing. Win sets are very narrow. Here's the rub of this, why this matters. Think about globalization and trade deals. What has been their problem? Who loses when the relative gains are in place? unions lose, small businesses lose, lots of domestic stakeholders. And you've had two problems, yeah?
It isn't when the jobs leave, price of manufacturing goes down.
Price of the goods do go down, and this is exactly right. The jobs leave the country, and the price of the goods go down. So let's think about this. If you were in central United States, and you were in a depressed town in the United States, what do you have? Shuttered factories and unemployment high. If you were at a Walmart, the price of consumable goods is lower in relative terms than it has ever been in history. And so, if I want to go buy that radio that I go buy is lower as a percentage of my income today than it was in the 60s and the 70s, by a vast portion. If any of you guys are interested, think about this for a second, just from your lives. How cheap are TVs?
Really cheap.
Really cheap. You go back 30, 40 years, right? TVs were a really expensive purchase. Now, you can go buy a really nice TV for $100. The price of consumable goods has dropped. Why? Because I get huge benefits from trade from having that TV made in China and then shipped into my Best Buy. The problem I have with it is if you're a coastal elite, does that benefit you? Absolutely. So someone who is a coastal elite, the price of goods that I'm dealing with is lower. Now, what if you're unemployed? You're dealing with the paradoxical problem is you don't have the jobs, but the goods are lower in cost than they've ever been. Right? That's the problem. When we think of this, what's been happening in globalization is it's not that we haven't been having absolute gains in trade. We have. Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, argues that gains in trade has lowered global poverty to a point that it is lower than it has ever been. And it's not that countries haven't benefited from trade. Both the US and China have benefited from trade. But go back to the two-level game. Who's been losing? Level one. The people at the original domestic constituencies. The people, the unions, the manufacturers, the laborers in the trade deals have been losing. And what do they feel has been happening? The trade deals have been struck without their consent. In other words, that what they're worried about is level two, the negotiation between the countries, and not level one, the domestic stakeholders. What you've seen with global populism is essentially a reaction to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism says as long as I lower the barriers, the absolute gains from trade will weigh out any relative gains between the countries, and everybody's better off. You can buy that radio at lower price. The global populist reaction keeps coming back saying, yeah, you struck a deal that may be better off for the United States, but it sure isn't better off for the unions and the factories that shuttered in my town, and for that reason, I want you to reject neoliberalism and ideology. And this is why globalization as an embodiment of neoliberalism and ideology is essentially under the kind of siege that it is. The win set for the domestic manufacturers is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and arguably, and this is where I really wanted to sort of push you guys, you go back to the Putnam argument, and you read the Putnam piece, and it's not an easy piece. He's got a lot of negotiating strategies in there that are really nice, where you can turn around and say, oh, I would give you this trade deal, but I can't pass it with these people, and how much leverage that gives you. Some interesting ideas in that. But if you go back to it, what's one of the bigger arguments that you get? People say they reject trade because they don't feel represented. Why don't they feel represented? Because increasingly the people negotiating the trade deals, do they listen to the people in the manufacturing towns? No, they don't. That notion of a two-level game is becoming broken down. Right? Increasingly, domestic stakeholders feel ignored. So if you want to understand the global revolt against neoliberalism, you want to understand why Bernie Sanders and Trump are on the same side. It's because both of them think trade deals fostered by neoliberalism is leaving those people to be poorer off, and it also argues that they're not getting listened to. And that's in part what you see with the push on globalization. Okay, that's it. We'll start in the next class. We're going to do some critiques of globalization from the left. We're going to do Marx and Lenin, read the Lenin piece. And by the way, the post-colonial stuff is difficult, but read it.